Well, I'm finishing up this 1980 Vibrolux reverb, and I've already neatened up the stuff in the doghouse. I don't need to show you that. That looks like so many of the other Fenders I've done. But I am going to install a bias level control, and this is something I get asked about a lot. This is a 1980 Vibrolux reverb, so this is one of the 70s circuits, even though it's from 1980. It's the last of the classic 70s circuits. And starting in about 69, earlier than that, 65 on the AB165 Bassman. But Fender started to do these circuits here that don't give you bias level control. You always have the same bias voltage, depending on the wall voltage, but you can control how much each output tube or each output tube side is biased. So this is just a bias balance. And that's a great way to use mismatched tubes and dial out any disparity between the push tube and the pull tube, or the push pair and the pull pair. But it doesn't let you adjust the overall bias. So the amp may just be a little bit on the hot side, and that's what it is, or a little bit on the cool side, and that's what it is. So I'm going to go in here and make this have bias level control while maintaining the bias balance, because that's a nice thing, and it's very simple to do. So the first thing I want to do is disconnect this resistor here from the wiper to the shell of the pot. And there are a few different variations on how Fender did the bias balance in different models over the years, but they all have this in common. There will be one resistor going from the pot to the shell of the pot, which is ground. So I'm going to heat that up and disconnect that, at least at one end for right now. And let's address the blue elephant in the room. You see this added capacitor here from this point on this pot to the shell of this pot. Originally, this was from here to a ground point on the chassis. In this case, I've just mounted it here. In the previous amps, which did have a bias level control, not the bias balance, this cap would not be in the circuit, but I often add that cap to the circuit from the wiper to the shell of the pot. You've seen that in many of the Fender videos I've done over the past couple of years. It just gets a little bit of the last remaining hum out of the amp, and that's how you achieve a very quiet amp. In these later 70s amps, it was built in. I've just put it here instead of over here to a chassis point. Anyway, I've got this resistor up in the air, and I'm going to measure it. And I'm measuring it because not only did Fender use different values in different models over the years, it doesn't matter what the stripes say, there's what it actually measures, because this resistor may have drifted. This measures 20K. Someone who's not red green colorblind is probably telling me that it was originally an 18K or something, but I don't, or even a 15K or a 22K. It's not a 22K, I can tell that. But I am removing that resistor. So I went ahead and prepped this little 10K trim pot. So I've got one leg bent down that's going to be soldered to the side of the shell, and this leg bent down and over that's also going to be soldered to the shell of the pot. So those two will be at ground. So even if the pot were to fail, it would still have resistance to ground. And this one I've got bent over, and it'll be up in the air, and a resistor will go from there to here. So if this was originally 20K, and I've got 10K variation here, we might put in a 15K resistor. We'll play around with that and see what gets this amp biased correctly with modern wall voltages. Sorry about that. I had intended to show the whole thing, but there's just no way for me to reach back here where things were with the camera here. I ended up having to get all the old solder off, so I had a much cleaner surface to work with without anything pooled up. And now this and this on the trim pot are both soldered well, though not excessively, to the shell of the pot. Reconnected the ground connection of this cap, which is actually the positive end because this is a negative voltage thing. And now I'm going to put in temporarily a 15K resistor from here to here, which will give us the existing 20K. And I've got before I do that, let me measure what this pot is and set it to about 5K. So we will be at the starting point that the amp had before I made this mod. All right, 5.45K, that's close enough for our purposes. So if this ends up being the correct value, this 15K, then I'll do a really pretty job with shorter connections and everything will be rock solid. But I don't want to do some elaborate connection right now if ends up not being the right value, because then you have to undo careful work with things that are crimped and things can overheat. There's only so many times you can solder to one of these little trim pots. So we want to make the most of the time that we have. I'm not going to crimp that until I know that I've got the right value resistor. And just a second, we'll confirm that it's the right value resistor and make all that pretty stuff happen. Once, find the right value resistor to get the bias range we need. And then go from there. So that is just tack soldered. Would never send this out into the world. That's not a totally reliable joint there, but it will do for our purposes. So let me get a speaker hooked up, get this powered on, and take some DCR measurements, and then we'll be ready to set the bias. All right, so powering this up with a 15K resistor with this 10K trim pot set halfway, so basically 5.4K. The bias right now, the output tubes, the 6L6s, are idling at about 26% dissipation. So that's way, way too cold, and that's what this amp had with the fixed 20K resistor. So I'm going to try taking this down from a 15K to a 6.8K, because I think with this bias trim pot halfway, we should be in the 50-something% range, not the 20-something% range. So let me do that real fast. And this is why I didn't do a permanent install of this first resistor. Every model from every different year is variables changed. Sometimes needs a slightly different approach to get where you want to be. We've gone from -46 to -39 on the bias now. We've gone from 423 to 403 on the B+. And our bias has gone from about 26% idle dissipation to about 48% idle dissipation. That means I'm really close. That 6.8K, I'm going to take that down to a 4.7K. And at that point, when the new 6L6s arrive, I'll know that I can make an adjustment with that trim pot. I'm actually going to hold off because these are my test JJ 6L6s, and I'm waiting for some tongue saws to arrive. And I want to confirm that we're in roughly the same neighborhood with the new tongue saws, just in case these old test JJs are a little bit weird. So I will revisit this after the new tubes are in place, and hopefully they'll arrive today. I can button this all up neatly and prettily and finish this video. Well, the voice coils in the original speakers were totally seized up. I mean, pressing on those cones, it just felt like concrete. Just the voice coil was not going to move, and they were not fantastic sounding speakers to begin with. So I've installed these warehouse G10Cs. This is a 10-inch version of the G12C, which is kind of the Jensen C12N speaker. And the owner of this amp watched my videos on the deluxe reverb comparison with the Alessandro, the G12C, and the ET65. And he liked these, or he liked the 12-inch version. So he asked me to put these in, and I have, and they sound very good. I was able to clean up the original wiring and reuse that. Still quite good, and I'll dress it away from the output tubes when the time comes, with a little clip there. For right now, I got to take the chassis out to do some other things before this thing gets buttoned up. But I wanted to show a nice trick you can do with the Vibrolux reverb. This is a fantastic sounding amp, but it is potentially loud for some modern stages. The original speakers were like 20 watts each. So with the old speakers, you can't really do this trick because you do have about 35, let's call it 40 watts coming out of this amp. A little bit more on that in a moment because there might be some confusion because I mentioned the 28 watt output transformer. But anyway, if you view this as a 35, 40 watt amp for safety. You can't pull one speaker with a 20 watt speakers. But if you have 75 watt speakers, don't worry about it not being able to move the cone or anything. These things are very efficient. You're going to have great response with these 75 watt speakers with this 40 watt amp. You can actually disconnect the ground. You can disconnect both wires if you want of one speaker. Usually I'll just disconnect the ground and put a little bit of low-tack tape around it so it can't touch anything it's not supposed to, and take one speaker out. And then instead of having a 4 ohm load, you have an 8 ohm load. So you lose about 3 dB from having the mismatch, and you lose 3 dB from only having one speaker. So you have a much quieter, much lower output amp that's still safe. It will behave a little bit differently with an 8 ohm load than a 4 ohm load, but it's within the realm of the pleasant when it comes to old Fenders. So that's one of the things I will do on Vibrolux reverbs, specifically almost, because it's rare for other amps to work the same way. A twin, you really need 100 watt plus speakers to do the same trick. Same for really a pro reverb, you could pretty much do this. But most people with a pro reverb, they want it to be a great big amp. They're not going to use it in a lower volume setting. This kind of lets you use this Vibrolux reverb at about the same level, maybe even a little bit lower than a deluxe reverb. So it's a nice way to make this good for mid-sized stages and small stages without doing any master volume installations or anything. Now, as to the output transformer being 28 watts, but this amp's still putting out 38, 35 watts, etc., etc. Let's see what the best way to describe this is. All right, let's say that this amp puts out 40 watts clean from its output section, disregarding the output transformer. And so from here is 0 watts to here is 40 watts. You just have a diagonal line, linear line. No watts, 40 watts. You can't see where my finger is. It's hard to do this like this. But you have it, in this case, we've got a 28 watt rated output transformer. So let's say 28 watts is right here. It's not like the signal goes up, hits that 28 watts, and cannot go any higher. That's 28 watts clean. This transformer can reproduce 28 watts cleanly. So what happens is you get that linear, hits 28 watts, and then it compresses and rounds over to its maximum. And because of that compression, you have a difference in sound as you push it. And that's one of the things we like about amplifiers in general, is that compression. And the Vibrolux reverb gives a lot of that. And you have to remember that as far as clean reproduction goes, you're probably at about 28 watts when the volume on the amp is on 3. And you go to 4, and you're going to get into that threshold transition mode where you get the compression. As you go higher, or you play really hard at 4, you'll get the occasional thing that gets up there in that spongy compressed range. So you don't have the same immediacy of attack at loud volumes, but you get really interesting harmonic distortions and compression artifacts that we like. The amp sounds exciting, and it's particularly good with a Telecaster or a Gibson with PAFs, because those pickups like to compress that amp in certain ways that a Strat kind of needs a little help to get there. If you use this with a Tube Screamer and a Strat, you'll be in that same kind of magic mojo compression part of the curve. Hope that helps. I know that this is not the best diagram compared to what, say, Uncle Doug might have drawn up for you guys, but I'm trying to get this amp out the door. Well, the postman came and went, and the new tubes did not come with him, so I have to wait for those to arrive before I finalize this. I expected it's going to be a 4.7K instead of the 6.8K, and as mentioned, it will be much shorter. But from this video, you get the idea, and this gives you bias level and bias balance at the cost of one additional part. That's nice. So soon the tubes will arrive. This will be finalized. You'll get a chance to hear this amp with the new speakers. All will be well. Until then, thanks for watching.